Hello, everybody. Tonight we're going to begin our work on Chapter 3, and our objective here in Chapter 3 is to actually begin building the application that we're going to be building for the majority, or the remainder of the course, actually, is the better way to say it. We're building basically a blog application using this framework, and in this chapter we're going to do some of the initial steps to get the project going. So even though the steps are kind of still, I would call like an overview approach of building an application, it's still very important steps for the whole application as we move through the course. And what's going to happen here is the things we build here in Chapter 3, we're going to continue building on through the rest of the book, so it's critical that we get things to work here before we move on to subsequent chapters. All right, let's dive into the content of the book. And what they are intending to do here is, if you read the introductory chapters, is to basically do exactly what I just said, is to get us in there and building inside the framework so we start getting a feel and familiarity for it. We are going to be introducing several new concepts in this chapter, not the least of which is a thing called rake commands, which allow us to do database work, create a database, migrate a database, seed a database, and it really what it is, it's like a collection of shortcut commands for us. And you'll get to know these pretty well and when to use them and how to use them as we progress through the course. We're also going to be looking at a couple of other types of code files that you may have not seen before, and I will mention those as we go through. Now, the type of project that we are going to be building here is basically a blog. And the reason that we do that is a blog is really kind of a very good example of a typical interactive Web 2.0, as I like to refer to it, type of application. A Web 2.0 application, in my mind, is the type of application that allows the person who's visiting the website to not only just consume the content of the website, but also to act as a contributor or an author on the website. So if you think of how you use social media, for example, blogs are really kind of like a fundamental level in social media, in that we switched, when blogs came out, from being just passive consumers of information on the screen in a static web world to being authors, creators, and interrelators, really, using it almost as a communication platform. So that, I think, is a pretty important concept. So a blog is kind of an ideal in that sense. And if you think of how a blog works, a blog, we kind of take it for granted, really, because when you look at, like, even just any old standard news site out on the web, a lot of them are done in a blog format. So they'll have articles that are posted, they'll be time-stamped, they'll have an author, they'll have their content, they might have some media or graphics attached to it. And then often at the bottom of an article, you'll see that some users will actually interact with the article and put in comments, right? I tend to not be one of those people that likes to comment a lot on articles, but I certainly see some lively discussions on certain articles, which is one of the reasons why I often stay away from them. However, that interactivity is pretty important in showing that there is real people, interacting with the content. And often that's looked at as one of the key cornerstone pieces of what we call Web 2.0. So the book is indicating that in the previous chapter, we very quickly created a new application, and guess what we're just about to do? We're going to do exactly the same thing right now. So I would ask you please to bring up your command prompt, whatever operating system you're using or whatever method you're using. And I just did a fresh install on this machine over the weekend of Windows, so I need to reset all my font sizes and colors here. So I like to go with the bright green on a black background. That's why don't I use defaults? I guess that's because that's how I've always done it. Because if I do use defaults, it still reverts back to whatever I set it to. Yeah, mine will. Should we test it? I'm not sure why. About mine, when I use properties, it still maintains it as a default. But it brings up the same interface, doesn't it? It does. So, I see. But see, if I choose defaults, it tries to set everything back to what it was. That's what it's doing. Where if I bring up properties, it shows me the current state. That's what the difference is. Okay. So if you need a way to go back to what it was normally, that's what that's their way of doing it. Okay, so that's good to know. But you see, I just like this look better. That's just a personal preference, and a little bit larger font size I think helps with these videos. I'm sorry? Thank you. I'm going to go ahead, and my first command that I'm going to type is cd space / just to get down to the root of the C drive. And then I'm going to preemptively go into my projects folder. So I'm going to type cd space projects. And it is from this location here that we are going to create our new app. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to try to split screen myself here, which I'm going to try to do often as we're working. And if you guys want to know another really cool keystroke combination, we were talking about that earlier, here's one that you might want to notate. If you hold on your Windows key and then use your left or right arrow, notice I did Windows key, left arrow, it took my command prompt, the active window, put it off to the right, or excuse me, the left side of the screen. And then on the right-hand side, it's giving me an option of which window I would like to put on in the remaining space. And I'm going to choose my PDF document there, just so I have both on the screen at the same time. And I think that's kind of a helpful way to work. Now, the first command that they want us to issue, of course, is to create a new project. You guys have done this before. So we're going to go ahead and say Rails space new blog. And go ahead and press enter. This will get the Rails engine running to build out the framework. And you can see it pre-creates a bunch of folders, files. At the end of that process, it runs the bundle install program, which downloads and installs all the required dependencies. Since many of these things have already been loaded on the machine, it's just use them instead of anything else. And you can see things went very smoothly. I don't think it did download and install one new thing, but that's really about it. So that was a pretty smooth creation process. What they will often ask you to do in this book is to then visit the folders that you just created just to get a familiarity with what you're building. And also because you're going to be doing a lot of work that's going to require interaction with the file system, most notably in the app folder is usually where we're going to do most of our work. We will do some stuff in config. We will do some stuff in the database folder. But that's, for the most part, that's really where most of our work is going to occur. So I like to just have the file folder open, and then if you want to explore and see the things that were pre-created like you did last time, it's not a bad thing to do. And you'll see that there's a pattern that's followed here, and as you get used to it, you'll be fine. Now, on page 29, the author has a listing here of some of the folders and files that you see and what is contained within them. I'm not going to read you this list. You can do that for yourself. But as we mentioned, the reason we do most of our work in the app folder is, if you read what the description is, all the components of your application. Well, it's no wonder why we do most of our work there, right? A lot of the other pieces that are in place here tend to be pieces that we don't mess with too much on purpose. Those are just files that are available for doing certain actions, certain libraries that we need to make the work happen, and certain configuration settings that we typically will not need to mess with at all. However, as we begin, we will need to do a couple of things to make sure that we're working in the correct mode here. So the first thing that we're going to do is we're going to visit the file indicated in listing 3.1 or 3-1, which is in the config folder, and we're going to look at the database YAML file. That's how we pronounce that, YML file. So go ahead and go to the database folder, and then you're going to see that, oh, wait a second, we don't have that file. Do you guys have that file? Right, and if you notice where I went, where did I go? I went to the database folder. No wonder I'm not finding it. All right, so, oops, I missed by one. But there it is right there, the database YAML file. Now, whatever tool you're using as a basic code editor, you're going to want to open up this file inside of that tool. All right, well, I opened up my Notepad++ as my text editor, pulling it onto the main screen here. And I'm going to take that database YAML file and drop it into the editor. Now, what I want you to take a look at here are a few things. So this clearly is some sort of a configuration file for the database. And what I want you to notice is that there's some settings in here that, of course, can be tweaked and changed. But these are the ones that we're working with by default. Now, notice that the default setting for database is SQLite 3. That is just the default for the environment. Notice that this file, even though it's a YAML file, and okay, I guess we should talk about what YAML files are. You know what YAML stands for? YAML ain't markup language, which means it's a shortcut language that can basically is just a text file with stuff thrown in it. And what happens here is you put in stuff kind of in plain English, and then the Ruby on Rails engine reads it and converts it into whatever objects or classes it needs to make things work. But this is just one of these shortcut files. And this one happens to define our database connections. Okay, so once again, the default adapter is SQLite 3, which we know that we've added. But notice that there's basically 3 different modes for database. And notice what they're all set to right now. All of them are referring back to the default. So this tool, like many other high-end tools, usually give you the option to choose what database you're using as you do your development, as you do your testing, and then finally as you move to production mode. For the most part, when I work with this technology, I don't see a reason to change away from SQLite 3. There are circumstances, though, where you might move to a server that doesn't like you running a little executable like SQLite 3, so you might opt to use MySQL or connect to a SQL Server database or an Oracle database. And there are tools available for this language that allow you to connect to all of those. And then in that case, you could come in here and define what those are as you move from, let's say, a development environment to a test environment and a production environment, and hypothetically have them all be different environments. Isn't that interesting? Right? So that's not really that unusual when working with an IDE. When we work with a product like Visual Studio, for example, that's kind of transparent in the background. We don't usually mess with the databases too much, and if we are connecting to something, it's either SQL Server Express or SQL Server. But even in that environment, you have the capability of establishing connections to the databases. Now, what this file basically does, it is a shortcut file for creating the database connection strings that in other languages we might need to fiddle with a little bit to get to work. Sometimes we have to do inclusions of certain libraries in order to do database connections, and then we might have to have very specialized syntax for making the connection string every time we do a database interaction. With Ruby on Rails, we define it here, and then we step away. Line 13, this special symbol. I'm not really sure what that special symbol means. I think that what it's referring to basically is this is the tool that we're using, and then clearly default is like a variable reference to what's up on line 7. So what we're saying is default is set to SQLite 3, and I'm not sure what the bracket means. That's something we could probably look up. But clearly we're using it as some sort of a pointer or a reference. So my guess would be that it's a pointer that pulls in that variable that's predefined. Yeah, well, right? Yep. They would actually create 3 separate databases in the process. But they're saying that the connection string that you're using to get the database connection going is SQLite 3. So that has, every database, Robert, has its own way of connecting to a development environment, and that's usually done with a connection string that's written for it. So what this is saying is right now, they would all use SQLite 3. If for some reason there was something else that we were using, you notice how on the default, how they have an adapter listed, a pool, and a timeout. If we were to, let's say, MySQL in one of these spots, let's say for production, we would have an adapter listed as MySQL. We would probably have some special environment variables that we would throw at it through the pool command. So like MySQL might require a certain string to connect to it, like the way that you log in typically. And then the timeout just indicates how long you wait before you declare that the connection is not working. 5,000 indicates 5,000 milliseconds or 5 seconds of waiting, if you're curious. And actually, that's a pretty long timeout for a database, but if you consider that, you know, who knows what the server's doing, or if the software is busy, sometimes that's not really an unreasonable amount to wait. So, all right, so that's the YAML file. And what we need to do is basically take a look here and just make sure that things are already set correctly. Now, here's my word of caution. We don't need to change anything here, even though it looks different than what's in the book. You could change it and manually place in each command here. So you see the pattern that we use for default, we could come in here and actually manually declare those things right here. But there's no reason to. There's been a little bit of an update in how Rails puts these files together. And the fact that there's this variable component, which did not used to be there in the pack, is actually a positive, because it allows us to have that same environment. If not, then we would use the syntax like you would see in the book. If this default statement was omitted or commented out, then we would have to go through and manually place these commands in there. Hopefully that makes sense to you. All right. But for the most part, we should not have to touch that at all. All right, now we're gonna jump back over to our command prompt now to do the next little bit of work. And what's going to happen is we want to, first of all, before we type this next command, and this is pretty critical, right now we're in the projects folder still, right? And in fact, we didn't even go through the process of seeing if our application even worked, did we? So why don't we go ahead, and I'm going to type a directory command to see that indeed the blog was created, and it was. I see the folder. So now I'm going to cd space blog to go into that folder. Now I'm going to go ahead and type Rails S, or if I wanted server, either one, same basic thing. And now I'm going to launch the web server from the command prompt. It's going to take a moment because that is a piece of software that's launching. And then now that it's up and running, I'm going to bring up a browser window. I guess I need to create a new tab and pull it over. And in that browser window, we're going to go to localhost 3000. And then hopefully the page will load up just kind of like it did in the past. So we know that at least it succeeded, okay? Really, that's our whole mission here, just to make sure that that actually launched and succeeded. I'm going to go ahead and close that browser window for now. And I'm going to come back over to the command prompt and do a Control-C to terminate the server. And then I'm going to press yes to stop it. Now that we are inside the blog folder at the command prompt, we can launch this next command. If you did this command outside of that folder, it would not execute. The reason that is it is folder dependent. So this framework realizes where you are in the folder structure, and when you issue a command, it attributes it to whatever the root project is. So in this case, that would be the blog folder. So now that we're in the blog folder, I can go ahead and type the command. So the command is rake db:create. Now, before I press enter on this, let's talk a little bit about what a rake command even is. A rake is basically a specialized subset of Ruby on Rails that has a bunch of shortcut commands that can do a bunch of different things. In this case, and in this book, we predominantly use it just to do simple database things. So in this case, you can tell I'm going to go ahead and create a database. And then later on, we're going to seed the database and then migrate the database. And those are typically the three functions that we're going to perform the most with the rake command. And what this is really doing for us, it's saving us knowing all the code that sits underneath that makes these commands happen. Because if you think about the process of creating a database, and if you guys probably have done this in a database class, I hope, you can do it a number of different ways. If you were using a graphical tool, you can click on File, New, Database, and then go through a bunch of graphical tools and create tables and anything you want. But if you learn from the traditional SQL or SQL approach where you learn to type the commands, either as a script file or at a prompt, this is in essence the equivalent of saying, create a new database, create some tables, create some permission. It basically handles that process for us without us typing any SQL code. So if you start to put that in your head as to the importance of what that's doing, that's the reason we have this shortcut language. I mean, as web developers, do we really want to sit there and mire ourselves in writing complicated SQL statements necessarily? Maybe, maybe not. I'm not going to pass judgment on that. But for the most part, we just want to kind of get it up and running. So this is a shortcut for doing that. So rake db:create will create the database.
Will it create the database in each environment?
No. That is a really good question. No, because we're not in development mode at this point. Excuse me, we're not in production mode. Wrong choice of words. But that's a good question, Richard. So for right now, we're creating it in development mode. Okay, that's a very good question. All right, I'm going to go ahead and press enter here and let it do its work. And as you can imagine, if it's creating a database, it has to generate the command for it. And then notice that what it did, it recognized the fact that the file already exists. But what did it do, Richard? It also created the test database to go with it. But it did not create a production database. Okay? The production database would be generated when we go into production mode and we deploy. But that's a really good question. But it assumes that, hey, you're a developer, you might want a test database too, so it generates it automatically. Now, I'm assuming you guys both did this process already? No problems?
I have scars.
You have scars to prove it. I love it. All right, I'm moving now to page 31. I'm looking at a couple of commands. All right, and notice what he says here. He goes, although you're concerned with the development environment at this time, it doesn't have to create the other databases while you're at it. So if you wanted to create all of them, I see the little part I highlighted there, and I know people watching online are probably going, what does that say? Well, the command would then be db create all, and then that would go ahead and create the production database as well. Now, truth be told, that there's no harm done if we do that. So if you want to type that command in, we can. So if you want to go back to your prompt and up arrow it and then add all to it, then it's going to go through the process. Now, it should already say the development database and the test databases already exist. That's what it should say. And that it created the production database for us. Okay, now granted, at this point, it's a little premature, but what it does, though, is it will keep all the databases updated synchronously so that when we do go to production, it's all set to go. All right, so that's just a handy little thing to know. Now, next command that they're demonstrating, we're going back to Rails-based commands. So we're going to use the keyword Rails, and then we're going to say db console. And you can imagine what that gives us. In fact, they show a little example in the book there, but that actually switches us to a command prompt SQL prompt or SQL prompt for SQLite. So at this prompt, I could type SQL commands if I was so inclined, or commands that are particular to this environment. We don't really have a lot of reason to work down here at the prompt, but what it does show you, though, is if you're a person who's comfortable with doing database stuff from a command line, and and I'll tell you, it typically tends to be more old school people like myself because that's how we learn database. Um, it's not really that mysterious. You can just type your commands there, and you can see that there's a little help menu built in. You just type .help, and then they'll give you examples. But at this point, what they do want us to do is .exit, according to the book, if you want to get out of that prompt. So just to show you that it's there if you wanted to do something nitty-gritty. And if you happen to be maybe working on a production environment somewhere and you need to jump into the database really quick and just take a peek at something or make a quick little change, having that tool available, and frankly, even knowing that the tool is there, sometimes is enough. All right, next thing that we're going to do is we're going to try another command that's listed here, and although this really at this point won't do very much, this is a rake command called db migrate. Now, as we learn more about these MVC applications, what you are going to discover is that a lot of times we will be defining the data for a database using code instead of necessarily creating the database constructs manually. And sometimes when we make those changes in our code, we then need to run this command, database migrate, which rebuilds the database with the new information. So if I added a code file that defined a new table, running this command would then build the table into the database for us. Simply writing the code itself isn't enough to build the table. We need the database to do the work. A migration, therefore, is when we have a code solution that defines a database component, and the migration allows that component to be created or altered as designated in the migration file. So I'm going to go ahead and press that. And one thing that you guys are probably going to see, you can see the book is going to give a little, well, I didn't get an error message back, but sometimes you might, I don't know if you guys got an error message coming back. Okay, so really nothing bad happened. Basically what this means is no errors and maybe something was done. But I can tell you with a high degree of certainty here, nothing was really done. Very simply because we haven't created anything as of yet. But the database is actual with that command run and no error messages coming back that the database is intact and okay. It's basically the way to read that. All right, now we're going to move on to some new things that we have not done before. And actually the rake commands, I guess, were new too. We are going to move down to the middle of page 32 now. And what we're going to do is we're going to create some objects within our application. And in order to really be able to build a database-driven application, we have to set up a model for some of the data that we're putting in. Now, without going too deep into what a model is, basically a model is a representation of data. We do it through code, and then once we run all of our commands here, it actually will build it out into the database so we have a repository to store that data. All right. So if you type the next command, which is Rails generate model, and that's a pretty generic expression. And what I'm going to do is that I'm just going to run this, and you're going to see that it's actually an incomplete expression, because really what I'm saying is I'm asking it to do a pretty important function here. Really what we're trying to do is generate a data model, and then what it's saying is, hello, you didn't put in all the stuff you needed to put in to make this work, and you see it really read me the riot act here, and basically, you know, if I made this full screen and you look at all the output, what it's really doing is it's saying, all right, that's not how you do this. What you really need to do is say Rails generate model and give me a name, and then here are all the possible switches that you can add, which you can read to your heart's content. And that's not really the primary thing for us right now, but I just want to show you what kind of output it's generating. All right, so there are a number of different switches that will come into place here. So why don't we go ahead and type the full command now. So it's going to be Rails generate model, and then we're going to type the word article. Notice carefully here that I'm using a capital A to do this. In this environment, there are stipulations for when you use things with capital letters, when you use things in plural format, or with lowercase letters, and they all have a special meaning, and we'll discuss those kind of as we go. But the key here is that we are going to generate part of the MVC structure now. We're going to create a model for a thing called article. All right, so we're going to go ahead and press enter and run that command. Now what that's going to do is it's going to create a number of different resources. The book details them there. You can see them on the right, and you can see that our result is similar. So notice the first little statement it put in there. It said invoke active record. Active record is the database abstraction tool that's built into the Ruby's on Rails environment. So what that does is it tells you intuitively that it created something inside the database. And what it did, if you look at the second line there, it says database/migrate, and then there looks like a really long numeric string, which is actually a date timestamp. So you know exactly when you created that migration. And if you look at it real carefully, you can see create articles. Notice lowercase a and an S at the end in plural format, and then that's a Ruby file. Then, in addition, in the apps folder, in the models folder, it created an article.rb file where our code that is specific to that model will reside. And then it created corresponding test files if we were to do our testing. The two key files that created is that article Ruby file in the apps model folder, and then the db migrate folder, and notice the name there, migrate. It created a migration that will, if we run the migration, will add that database content to the table. If we were to physically look at the database right now, there would be nothing in it. That table would not exist. But as you'll see here in a moment, we are going to be doing that in just a second. But what they would like us to do is actually look at some of these files that were created. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to look at the db migrate create articles file. So I'm going to pull up my file folder here. We're going to go to db migrate, and then you see the file that we created. I'm going to give that a right click and edit with Notepad++ here. And you might actually see that this file might look slightly different than what's in the book. In fact, for the most part, it's identical with one little change. And that is, notice the square brackets and the 5.2 here. So that's one slight little change. I'm not really too worried about that. In fact, remember the rule of thumb here is if the framework's doing it automatically, don't mess with it. right? So don't tweak this code to make it look like the book just because the book is different. Just please keep that in mind. Inside here, you can see that we have a class called create articles. And then we have a method inside there called change. And notice what it does here. And we remember, we're not experts on this language yet by any means, but you can guess as to what it's going to do. It says create table articles do. There's a T inside of pipes, and then T timestamps and end. Somebody speculate what that's going to do. Educated guess.
So we can add a column called timestamp.
It will add a column called timestamp, and what do you think will go into it, into the timestamp column? Timestamp. Yeah, so automatically, every time there's an entry made in this, we're going to create a table called articles, and whenever you see the word do, that implies a loop in this language. So it's going to go through and create articles every time we do a change in the database. So every time we add an article, it will also timestamp the article automatically. If we wanted, for example, to do other stuff in here, we could code it in manually if we wished. But this is just like the fundamental part of it. Now, if you look at the top of the next page, they actually have an example of a migration that's about to happen. So for example, what they're doing in this file is they're adding a couple of things that help to define the structure of the table. Now, what I want to say preemptively here, this is one way to do it. So we created this model manually. And now we're going to go into the code file and manually add what looks like database columns. In fact, that's exactly what they are. So if you wanted, or actually you need to do this because this is part of the work here, is you can paste that code in like I just did, and you don't want to indent it. Remember, 2 spaces for each indent. And our author leaves a blank line in there if you want to do it like that. But this is not too hard to figure out. What's happening here is we are creating a column that will hold a string called title, another column that will hold text. So that sounds like a string, but sounds like it would hold more. Pretty intuitive, I think. Calling that one body. And then we're creating a third column called date time, or a data type of date time. That's going to be called published at. So we are going to have those 3 columns in addition to the one that was automatically generated for timestamps. One question I get from people is, can I delete the timestamps one if I want? Sure, why not? If you wanted to, you could. Do I see a reason for it? Not really. I think actually having timestamps for whenever something was altered in a database is a really useful tool, especially when you're trying to troubleshoot problems, which is why it's included in the first place. And if you remember that adage of convention over configuration, if it's throwing it in there, you're probably better off leaving it in place. All right, so now we have this file altered. So we are basically defining an articles table, and every time we create an article, it's going to be in this format: title, body, published at with a timestamp. Okay, so we're defining manually a database table in a code file. So if you still have this open in your editor, do a Control-S to save it. And now we're going to go back to the prompt, and now we're going to run rake db migrate again. And this time when I press enter, what's going to happen is it's going to go to that migration folder and look for migrations and changes to the migrations. And as a result, it went in and did what? It's pretty easy to see what it did. It read that file, it created the table, and all the columns that go with it. So this is a pretty cool thing, folks. Now, what we're going to do next is we're actually going to take a break before we go to the controller section. And before I jump into the controller section, I'm also going to introduce a different tool to you guys that we can use to actually look at the database in a graphical way. And we'll do that after we take 5. All right, so as we come back from our break now, we're ready to move on to this next section about generating a controller. We were just having a little discussion about how you work with the database and how you get things, knowing that things are actually working correctly. And there is actually a database tool that I recommend for use in this class. And let me bring up a browser tab here and bring it over. And it's a tool that's called Lite browser. And it's a free piece of software that allows you basically to get an interface not too dissimilar from like MySQL Workbench or PHP MyAdmin or the SQL Server Management Studio. That sort of a tool where you can look at your tables, that you can launch SQL commands if you need to. So if you actually just search really quickly for SQLite browser, or if you want to go directly to this URL, which is sqlitebrowser.org, and that'll bring you to this page, and download the version that's appropriate for your operating system. I'm going to grab the 64-bit Windows version. And I'll tell you, this is a very handy little tool that I've been using for a while, working within this environment. It's completely free. What more positive I can say about it. Any tool that's free that works great is always a positive in my mind. There's a couple little quirks with the process of using it that's a little different than some other tools. But if you're familiar with most database tools, you can find your way through this pretty easily, at least my opinion. The majority of why we're going to use this tool is to be able to take a graphical look at the databases that we're working with, and then in some cases go into the databases and actually manipulate data or verify that data went in, or to see if it actually made it into the database. Because sometimes when you're doing things from a command prompt or you're doing it from a browser window, you're not really sure, so why not have a tool that helps you, is kind of my approach for this. So as it finishes up the install, and of course I'm going to watch the detail view here to see what it's doing. Well, it looks like it's doing the installation at the moment, so hopefully that won't take too much longer. Now this is a tool that's designed strictly for using with the SQLite database. So if you try to connect this up to like a MySQL database or something, it's not really going to help you. When you're done with the install, go ahead and click Finish, and then it will open up the tool so that we can look. Now what I'm going to do in the interim here is I'm going to pause the recording of this video, waiting for you guys to catch up here again. All right, now that all of us have it installed and up on the screen, I'm going to go ahead and just maximize the window here. And the first thing that we need to do is we actually need to connect to a database. So the first thing we're going to do is click on this Open Database button up here at the top. And now you'll navigate to the folder where your project database is located. So for me, it's off the root of the C drive in my projects folder. We're going into the blog folder and then into the database folder, and we are working on the development database. So I'll leave that up on the screen here for just a moment. So it's in your blog app, database folder, development database. And yes, the file extension is SQLite 3. Once you have that, go ahead and click Open. And then once you open it up, what it does is it reads the default schema from the database. So it shows you the tables that are present and some of the resources that go with it. Notice it also indicates here in the schema column in SQLite sequence that were automatically generated by the product itself, as many database tools do. They keep track of themselves. Notice that there's also additional structures here for indices, views, and triggers. And if you've studied databases, you're familiar with those terms. But those are not really our concern. Notice that you do have the ability here to actually manipulate the database. You can create tables and do other things with those tables. But for right now, what we're going to do is we're going to click on Browse Data. And then once we switch to that tab for Browse Data, notice that there's a drop-down box where we can then select the articles table. And notice inside here the columns that we added to that code file. So we added the title, the body, and published at. Notice that it automatically timestamped it with created at and updated at. Those are just automatic. So these are the timestamps. It's not one, but two. And it makes sense. What is the creation date for the file? And what is the update? So if there was an alteration made. And then notice also that there automatically is an ID column created as well. Now, if we had created data for the database table, you would see that in the database. But right now, all we have is the columns. But we have verified that the database is accessible and that the table is created, and now we have kind of a snapshot of what we're working with. So now what I'm going to do is I'm actually, instead of closing this, I'm going to just pull it out of the way and minimize it. And you know what, I'll actually get this browser window off to the second screen and out of my way. So now we're going to press forward with the commands that are on page 34, where we're switching modes to creating a controller. All right. Okay, so let's go ahead and give this command a try. And what we're going to type in is Rails generate controller articles. And I want you to notate something that's really important here. When we created the model, notice we created the data component first, which is kind of interesting. So we used the model to imply a data structure. When we ran the database migration, it created the table and added the columns that we wanted to the database. So now not only are we implying a data structure, but we actually created one in the database. Now we're going to switch over and create a controller that's going to be related to that database table. And I want you to look at the naming convention here, which I think is an important takeaway, that when we created the model, we referred to the articles in the singular. We called it article with a capital A. When we deal with a controller, we're calling it articles plural with a lowercase a. That is not a mistake. That is a convention used in this environment. And the thinking is basically this. If I have an articles table, and I want you to notice that in the database, even though when I generated the model, I called it article singular with a capital A, do you notice what it created in the database? Articles plural with a lowercase a. That is not by mistake, that is how the structure works. So what this is implying to you is that it would make sense that if you create a table to hold articles plural, that you call it articles, and that each instantiated entry in the database, if you pull the data out and instantiate it in your application as an object, which is what you do in this language, it is an article singular and identified uniquely, and therefore the capital A. Now, why they came up with that convention, I really don't know, but that's the convention. But it is not by mistake. So now that we're going into the point of getting ready to generate a controller, A controller is the piece of the MVC application that's going to receive data from the user in the browser and then react to it and then do whatever component is necessary. So really what we're creating is a code file that's going to intercept the incoming traffic and then route the traffic and run code relative to whatever that particular aspect is.
So,
I had, and I'm going to run this command now, and like in the book, we'll be looking for an output that indicates that certain things were created in the process here. So hopefully you got output that looks similar to this, and it shows you all the different things that were created. Notice that we have a controller file. Notice how the controllers are named, controllers with Ruby extensions. We have ERB files. We've already learned that those are what we call embedded Ruby files, so it's a mix of HTML and Ruby code, and that's in the app views articles folder, so what the viewer sees. We have some stuff in the test unit folder. We also have a helper file that's created by default. And then, of course, the JavaScript and CSS shortcut languages are automatically added as well. All right, the next thing that we're going to do is we're going to actually run another command. It's a little bit more complicated, and I don't expect you to memorize this at this point in time. But it's going to show you that from a command prompt, not only can we generate stuff like these complicated, page structures and database entries and things, but we can actually start putting stuff into our pages with a type of command called scaffolding. Scaffolding is a really kind of unique part of the MVC architecture, regardless of what language you're using to do MVC. But scaffolding basically gives you a way to automatically build kind of like default components that go into an application, namely the ability to manipulate entries in our data models that then get displayed on our pages. So what we're going to do here is we're going to take this whole command, and I'm going to copy paste it, and I recommend that if you have that capability that you do the same. Otherwise, make sure you type it very carefully. And then let's take a moment to read the command before we just press enter willy-nilly. And apparently I must have, did you see, you guys notice I wasn't touching my screen here? It just pasted in a little bit strange. So I think what happened is it didn't all paste in at once, and then the skip migration came after the fact, and probably just kind of messed up exactly what I did here. So after published datetime, so I see what happened is because this command spanned 2 lines in the book when I did the copy paste, it pasted in 2 pieces, so it grabbed that line change as a carriage return. So it dropped it in and pressed enter for me. When really I wanted to do this. But the command says Rail generate scaffold article, title string, body text, published at, skip migration. So now I'm getting a conflict report right now because I didn't complete the command last time. So do I want to replace this? And I'm just going to go ahead and say yes. That's really the wise choice here. Here's another conflict. I'm going to say yes. We're going to replace it. And one more conflict. I'm going to say yes to replace it. And anytime I'm getting that. So I had 4 circumstances there. Now notice what this did. This created a whole lot more stuff, right? So the first thing it did is it created articles controller file. We are going to take a look at those in just a moment. And notice it created, look at 4 articles. It created, in the views folder, an index file, okay? It created an edit file, a show file, a new file, underscore form. We'll talk about that in a second. Created some things for testing, some helpers, some JSON builder files, and then some ACID files. The ones that we're really concerned with right now are the ones in this ERB folder. And notice really what we're doing is when it generates a scaffold, what it's doing is it's giving me a way to look at the articles, to edit the articles, to take a look at them, to create a new one, and then there's an underscore form. And here's a little clue. Whenever you see that prefix of an underscore relative to one of these ERB files, that indicates that it's a partial. It's a partial view. It's not a complete page. And the part of the page that this is the form that allows you to enter the data related to that data model for articles. So it will have fields for all the fields that we generated in the table automatically. That's what's in that form. And it did that all automatically, created the interface components for us. Now the book has us going out to this URL. And in fact, if you want to do this, make sure that you first launch your server. So come over here and type Rails S, get that server running. And then once you actually have that up and running, you can follow the link in the book, and it should work. And I'm going to be brave and click on it. And of course, it comes up on screen number 2 here. But here it comes up. And then notice the URL we're going to. Because we're dealing with articles, we are going to the articles controller to see the content. Of course, there are no articles at this point in our blog. But without really having done any work, you can see that it's listing the columns we created. It's got title, body, published at. They don't look very pretty, but they also have a mechanism and a link there for a new article. If you wanted to be brave, you could actually go ahead and click that. That's what they demonstrate on the next page. And then as I click that, I want you to notice 2 things. First of all, I did no coding to make this happen. And secondly, take a look at the URL as well. And this is the feature that's unique to MVC, folks. This first part of the URL, following the machine name, is articles. Articles relates to the articles controller. So really, the first thing after the slash is the controller that we're going to. After that slash is the name of the method in the controller that we're triggering. And we're going to go look at the code to see how this works. But now I can see that I've created a mechanism here for developing a new article. And I'm sure the book is going to have us type in some stuff. So if you want to copy what they have, that's fine. They call it Beginning Rails 4. And then in the body, we can type a whole bunch of stuff here, which doesn't really matter. Just put something in there to work with. And then, please keep in mind that these boxes here are expandable with that little handle. You can just grab the corner and move it. And notice that by default, the published at date will read today's date. So if you wanted to change this stuff, you can. And I'm not necessarily picking a time, but I could pick a time if I wanted to pick a time. When I'm done, I'm going to go ahead and say Create Article. And then that takes me to the article. And I want you to see here that what it's doing, check the URL. Now after articles, it's got a number in there. And that number happens to be 1, which corresponds to the ID of this article in my database. Isn't that interesting? In fact, if I want to verify that, I could go to my SQLite browser. I could refresh that table, and now you can see that content that I put in there And yes, you can tweak these columns here. There's the title. There's the body I typed, the published at, created at, updated at, and they're all present in my database. And that number 1 from the URL corresponds to the number 1 ID number in the database, which is auto-generated and auto-incremented. That was all handled for me automatically. And then I also want you to notice that I have the capability to edit this. So I could come in here and add some more stuff to the body, if I want. And then update the article, and then that change persists. Now, if you think of what we just did, and if you had to code this by hand, yeah, it is cool, right? This is like stuff that took you like a month to do in PHP class, right? And thus the popularity of this format. Also notice there's a little bit of CSS thrown into the mix too. Not a lot, but a little bit. Enough to make it interesting and functional. I'm now going to click the back button, and that's going to take me back to the articles page, where now we can see the beginning of a listing of the articles in the database. It's not pretty.
Like this page.
Yeah, this isn't. Yeah, you know, it is. It's primitive HTML. It's, like I said, some basic functionality to it, but nothing really too fancy. In fact, if you were really to deploy this somehow, you would do some sort of CSS to this and make it look a completely different way. But what's fascinating, though, is now that we do have a listing, of our article, a snapshot of the content, the published at date, and then notice on the far right side, the ability to look at it, edit it, or destroy it, get rid of it altogether. Now, typically what I find at this point in time, that the destroy doesn't always work, but that's kind of a separate issue. But you can try it if you want, and I would recommend that you leave at least one article in here, so maybe create a second article and just give that a try. So just feel free to experiment and see it in action. As I switch back over and go away from the browser and take a look at what's happening in the background here, do you guys notice that the web server view on the command prompt, do you notice how verbose it is in getting all the interactions that are happening on the web page are being logged by the web server? So I can see everything that's happening, and every time somebody does a click to show an article, for example, it says article controller show as HTML parameters ID 1. We already figured out what that is, and what does it do? It loads an article from the database, and what does it do for us? It writes a SQL statement that pulls in the article for us. Isn't that wonderful? And then pushes that out to the web browser without us having to worry about any at all SQL statements in the slightest. Pretty powerful little construct here. All right, at this point, we're going to stop the web server from running, so click in the command prompt window, do your Control-C, type your capital Y, press Enter, and stop the server from running. We're going to come back over to the prompt now, and we're going to actually add some stuff. And I want you to notice what we're going to do here kind of in a brute force way. And I'm going to be careful now because I figured out that these commands that span 2 lines, I'm going to do a little trick here. I'm going to actually go to Notepad++, create a new file, paste that in. Anything that spans 2 lines, it's going to read the line change as you pressing enter. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to come in here and I'm going to delete that second line and just move the content up so it's all one string. All right. Then I'm just going to Control-A, Control-C to copy, and then I'm going to take that over to the prompt. I'm going to paste it in and then just talk about it for a moment before I press enter. So what we're going to do now, reading the first 3 parts of this, is we're going to initiate a Rails command called generate, and this time we're going to run a migration. Notice we're going to run a migration directly from here without doing the rake db migrate. And what we're doing is we're going to add an excerpt and location to articles. Excerpt is a string and location is a string. So really what we're doing here is we are creating a change in the structure of the database from the command prompt with one command. So we're adding an excerpt field. If you guys ever look at blogs online or news articles online, often what you get is a headline and a little blurb, and then when you click on it, you get the whole article. That's the thinking here. So we're creating that excerpt field, and then we're also adding a location column to the table as well. So let's say, it was written, in Oklahoma or something, you could type in a location. But not only is it creating those two columns, it's also running the migration. So it's adding the code that will do it, and it runs the migration directly and adds it to the database. When I press enter, and hopefully that will be what happens. See, I'm not always so hopeful with this technology. Hopefully this will be what happens. All right, and that's actually a good result there. So it went ahead and it created the migration for us that will allow those things to happen. Now, what I want to do, as the book is showing here, is it's having us go to that migration file and take a look. So let's go open that file. So I'm going to go to my migration folder. And notice the new file. We're going to open that up in a text editor here. And then we're going to do a little bit of a comparison to what we have in the book. So I'm going to kind of minimize the size of this just a little bit. You can see it a little bit more clearly. So notice the command here, add a column to articles called excerpt, which is a string. Add a column to articles called location, which is a string. And that matches up exactly with what's in the book here. Now we're going to come back to our prompt after we've done the migration generation, and we're going to run the rake db migrate, spelled correctly. That's important too. You can't migrate, you got to migrate. And then once you go ahead and press enter for that, hopefully you get an output like you see at the bottom of the window here, which indicates that the migration succeeded. So it added a column, added another column, and basically altered the table. You want to be sure that it happened. Come back here and do a refresh, and you can see the new columns are now in place. I'm going to collapse this down so you can see those two new columns located inside the database. All right, so we were able to alter the database table after it was already created and do it all from the command prompt. If you want to decipher the command prompt a little bit, when we ran that command, Rails generate migration, those are just the commands that generate the migration. The next part, add excerpt and location to articles, is a name that we chose, which indicates what we did. So that way when I go look at my migration folder, I can just look at that and instantly know what that migration is doing. And then the actual action that we're creating, which is a new column called excerpt, which is a string, and a new column called location, which is a string, that was just hard-coded right into the command. So really, hopefully demystifying it, I'm hoping slightly for you. All right. Next thing that we're going to do is we're going to try this next command. And once again, this is a multi-line command, so I'm going to copy that whole thing over to Notepad++, and I got that one blank tab here. And I'll paste that in and then get rid of that extra line like so. And then I'm going to Control-A, Control-C, Control-V here at the prompt. All right, so if you read this now, look at what we're doing from the prompt this time. Now we're going to generate a scaffold again for article, and we have title string. All right, we already have that. I'm not sure why we're doing it again. Location string, excerpt string, body text, published app, skip migration. All right, so go ahead and press enter on that one. And now what this should do, as you'll see in just a moment, it maybe is not exactly what you would intend, because really what's happening is we already created these things, right? I mean, that's what your head should tell you. So why are we trying to do it again? But what it's showing you is if I wanted, I could define the whole structure of the database table using a command like this without having to drop the code into a migration file, which is why we have skip migration. It's not going to generate a migration because we don't want it, basically. However, if I did not have this content created and I wanted to create a new table and a new structure, I can create that entire structure with one command from the prompt. And you know what? It's not really even that hard to do. So notice what it's doing is it's trying to create the stuff, and what is it finding? It says identical. Let's try this one. Oh, that's identical. Oh, let's try this one. It conflicts. Do I want to replace it? Sure. You know, or I could actually say no. And, honestly, does it really matter? No, honestly, it does not, because these things, we know they pre-exist, right? And this is part of the experience factor here, working with this stuff. We already have all these things in place. Now, I might find, and sometimes I walk these paths intentionally, folks, that if I go to the table here, I do have excerpt and location. However, what's going to happen if I launch this in a browser? Well, let's find out. Right? How do you find out? By actually doing it. So let's launch this in a browser and see what happens. Because maybe I shouldn't have said no. Okay, so now it's up. And we're going to go back to our browser window, wherever that is. And you know what? Can I just refresh this? Sure, why not? All right. Looks the same. I'm going to go to show. That's okay. But what's missing? Right, the two new things that I added. I shouldn't have said no. Right? So you see how I kind of intentionally screw it up on purpose to show you how the command works. So if I go back now, cancel the server, up arrow a couple of times to go back here, run that command again, but this time say yes.
Instead of going one by one, is there like, yes, everything?
Yeah, the A technically does that. I'm not always comfortable with that because I want to see what it's changing. That's just me. And really the truth is, I know what it's changing, but if you don't sometimes take a moment to look. Now, if I had like 500 changes, yeah, I would be hitting that A real fast. All right, so now let's go ahead and launch the server again. There it is. And instead of refreshing this page, which isn't logical, I'm going to go back to the articles page. And actually, it's going to article 1, which is not quite what I wanted. But notice now that location and excerpt are part of the structure. More interestingly, take a look at, in my command line command, title string, location, excerpt, body, and published at. That's the order in which they appear here. So from that command, not only did I get those objects into the view, right, I also dictated the order right from that command. It shows you how powerful that command really is. So if we want to like do an edit to this to see if it sticks, let's just say location, Racine, excerpt, something a little snarky, right? And you can see that it did succeed. When I go back to the articles page, notice now how location and excerpt are included. And yes, this is a primitive view right now without a lot of CSS attached. But this is the default CSS for Ruby on Rails. All right, let's jump back over to the book and see how far we're getting here. And we're getting to the part on validations at this point. All right. The next thing that we want to look at, and we just completed this little exercise here and took a look and were able to manipulate the page as indicated. But now we want to go to this location here, which is the app models article RB file. So we're going to look at the Ruby file for the models in the app folder. So we're going to go to the app folder, models, and then article RB. Go ahead and open that up inside here, inside your code editor. And then we're going to add a short snippet of code, indent 2 spaces, and the command is validates underscore presence of title, comma, body. All right. So it doesn't take really much of a genius to figure out what's going on here, but what we're doing is we're adding validation to a form in this environment by simply typing some commands that are very verbose and pretty user-friendly and easy to understand without having to write some complicated JavaScript code or do server-side scripting of some sort, with some weird language that checks to see if it's an empty string and, throws a bunch of different scenarios at you. This is a very simple command, and we're going to explore these validation commands because really what it is, it's kind of like a shortcut code. So validates presence of is equivalent to like, did they leave that empty? Right? You don't want to create a blog entry that doesn't have a title and doesn't have any text in it, right? So those are considered to be required components for a blog article. Notice location and excerpt are not, but these are required. All right, so let's go ahead and save this file if you haven't done that already. Now, if you still have the web server running, which you probably do if you're following along with me, now you should be able to go back, create a new article, and then skip entering any content, and then notice how automatically it highlighted the errors that we have by just simply altering the code. Notice I did not have to reboot the web server because this is a change to a code file that's rendered automatically in the environment. So this is one of those files that you can live edit while the machine's up and running. And then notice that it automatically generates error messages and highlights the fields that have the problem. I mean, it's pretty clear where the problems are. I didn't code these error messages in. This is just what it does automatically for validation. But once again, a very powerful little on a construct here. All right. The other thing we want to go look at now is this next file, which is, once again, in the apps folder, in the controllers folder, and then we're going to be looking at articles controller RB. So give that a right click and open it up in your text editor. And what we're going to do here is we're going to do a little bit of a comparison with what we see in our file versus what we're seeing in the book. And here's where we kind of proceed with a little bit of caution, frankly. And that caution is basically knowing when things are okay to be the same and when it's okay to be different. So before we actually go too far into this, what I want you to notice in this particular file that we see, the articles controller, remember we generated this through a scaffold. We did not write any of this code directly. But because we scaffolded it, we implied that we're attaching to a data structure in the database, and because we're doing that, there's certain default database actions that we always do. We look at the stuff, we create new stuff, we might edit the stuff, we might create something from scratch, we might remove something, and all of those have pre-built tools in this environment that allow you to do that. And some of the syntax for right now, I'm not really too worried about you wrapping your head around, but I just want you to be aware of the fact that these things are automatically created. If you do see some changes between what you see in the book and what is generated automatically by the environment right now, that does not mean that you should go in and start changing this file to match what's in the book. Let the automatically created stuff be what it is, because there are version changes and code changes that happen as a result. So really what this is a moment for you to look at what was created and basically examine it and notice all the stuff that's done automatically for you that you do not have to code. Now you'll notice that we have reached the end of the chapter. So it seems that everything is working okay so far. Now I know some of you may have run into some problems with the JavaScript error. I did not run into that issue in this iteration. But if you have completed all the tasks as I have, and we're screenshotting along the way, you have in essence completed Chapter 3. Remember that this version is the foundation for the rest of the versions of this application that we're going to adjust as we go. So it's pretty important from that standpoint. I'm going to end this video here, and then I'm going to try to fix anybody's problems here in class if there are some. And we'll see you in the next video.